From battlefield to bomb shelter, from home front to hospital, from volunteer rosters to victims lists, women experience war in distinctive gendered ways. These are their stories. These are their voices. Welcome to Voices of Women at Wartime, a podcast by the Center for Women's Justice in Israel. I'm Rivka Lubitch. My co-host Rachel Stomel isn't with us today. A big mazel tov to Rachel and her husband Amichai on the birth of twin girls. It's so nice to have such good news in these hard times. We wish them health and happiness in raising the two new additions to their beautiful family. Sheyigdelu leTorah, lechuppah, ulema'asim tovim. And now, back to our regular business. The lives of all of us living in Israel have changed dramatically in the last few months. We're all feeling a loss of sense of stability. Soldiers dying, constant news of violence, hundreds of thousands of people evacuated from their homes, having to commute to keep their jobs, or worse, losing them, children starting schools that they're not familiar with, and all of us not knowing what's next. In the third episode, we spoke with Rina Levanon about her family moving from the north to a kibbutz in the center of Israel. She's still away from home. We had an episode where we interviewed psychologist Lisa Flegel talking about the emotional issues of post-trauma that some of the evacuees suffer from. And just after that, we spoke with Sarah Evron from Kibbutz Saad, who told us about life in the hotels, where she and the other kibbutz members are being put up at the present. There is no question that all of these sudden changes in people's lives, the violence, the stress, the insecurity, the loss of loved ones, all these factors lead to the outbreak of new problems or to old problems arising. Today we are going to touch on a very sensitive topic. In what way has the war had an impact on the issue of sexual harassment? We know that in the best of times, women and girls, men and boys also, but mainly women and girls, can suffer from sexual abuse. I am extremely curious to learn about the impact the war has had on this issue, and I am not very optimistic. Today, I will be talking with Shana Aaronson. Shana is the director of Magen, an organization that she will tell us about in a moment. Her educational background is in the mental health field, and she previously served as assistant director of Tzofia, a therapeutic residential facility for at-risk youth, and then as COO of Jewish Community Watch. Shana has trained and volunteered as a madrichat kalot and doula for women with histories of sexual trauma. Hello, Shana, and welcome to CWJ's podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, I'd like to hear about what Magen does, the organization that you direct.
Sure. So in our regular lives, before the war started, Magen dealt with sexual abuse, primarily within the Haredi and Dati communities, from a number of different perspectives. We have a few different machlakot, if you want to call it that. The first is education and awareness raising. So we created various different educational materials appropriate for the religious communities, for example, coloring books for Haredi children and Dati children that deal with issues of muganut and personal safety, bodily autonomy, as well as educational programs for parents, as well as a platform online that raised a lot of awareness to kind of highlight the voices of survivors of sexual abuse within these communities, voices that are not often heard, or when they are heard, we've always found they often in a very kind of voyeuristic way, as opposed to highlighting the courage and power of these women and men that are survivors of abuse. So we do a lot of that as well.
Can you explain that last sentence
Sure.
again? I just want to understand that better.
Absolutely. So one of our online platforms is really like its primary goal is to highlight the voices of survivors. Because a lot of the time there has in recent years been a lot of conversation and talk in mainstream media even about sexual abuse in the religious communities and Jewish religious communities, but we've really found that often it's sort of these stories are told in a very kind of voyeuristic way, almost like we're sort of looking in on people like they're like animals in a zoo, as opposed to really showing or telling stories from the perspective of the survivors themselves, of their experience, their power, their bravery, their courage, which there is so much of. And obviously those stories have to be told in a way that honors their privacy and what they want to share versus what they don't want to share. But we just believe that it's really, really important for those voices to be told in a way that respects the survivors. So that's a lot of what we're doing there. And then we also have our kind of mental health department. So we have a social worker who deals with referrals to therapy. We work with clinics all over the country as well as Private Therapist Foundation that funds therapy for survivors that can't afford it and that are not able to access therapy through the national clinics, as well as running a number of different support groups for survivors of abuse in Hebrew and English, mothers of survivors, ex-wives of abusers is another group that we have, and things like that. And then finally, we have our advocacy and investigation team that deals with supporting survivors of sexual abuse and their families in dealing with law enforcement and criminal, civil, legal proceedings.
That's amazing. So you have all these types of people working in your organization. You have psychologists, social workers, attorneys.
We don't have any attorneys in-house within our team right now. Hopefully we will soon.
Right.
We have a number of criminologists, we have social workers, we have therapists, we have educational guidance counselors, and then we have attorneys that we work with and refer to, quite a number of them actually.
Hold on, I wanted to ask you what criminologists do. I know I asked you beforehand. I'm very interested because my daughter was thinking of going into studying it, and we were wondering, what actually do they do?
Criminology, it's a very interesting field. It is very much adjacent to a psychology degree. There's a lot of it's sort of held in the same sort of level in terms of a lot of the kinds of learning, but there's more of a focus on criminology and victimology. So I guess putting it in lay people's terms, like what goes on kind of behind, what leads up to criminal behavior? What are some of the either personality factors, whether nature or nurture, of what happens, what goes on in the mind of a criminal, what goes on in the history or the childhood of a criminal, and then also some of the motivations of the crimes themselves, as well as victimology. How do perpetrators choose their victims? And there's some profiling. Criminologists in Israel are generally trained to do what's called harachat mesukanut, which is risk assessments, kind of gauging a potential or a accused perpetrator's ability to have experience empathy, or be rehabilitated, things like that.
So in your work, it would be more to work on awareness, because usually you would be trying to get into the mind and the lives of the victim, but here you're trying to get into the mind of the perpetrator. So that would be to keep safe from him.
Yes, it's also to help build cases. We do not claim to be any kind of alternative to the police at all whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite. A big part of our job is to help victims get to the police and go through the process of reporting, whether it be to social services or to the police, to the courts, in as least difficult a way as possible. It's obviously a very grueling and can be really awful process, kind of going through that whole system of making a police report and the confrontations that are involved and the questions that are asked by the police as they're doing their investigation. So a part of what our staff do is they try to work with the victim and with the police to help them build the case. And I don't mean build the case like build evidence. I mean to help them identify what are, let's say, perhaps there are witnesses. Perhaps the victim disclosed to a teacher years ago. And while the police may not have the resources or just kind of the way the police work here, they might not go out searching for that person, especially if they've now moved to another country. But we know that that's going to make a really big difference for the case and also be really significant in terms of validating the survivor's experience that there was this witness. They did hear this conversation years ago. We will help find that person and track down, things like that.
Very important. Okay, before I ask you about what the impact of the war has been on your work, I want to understand, I know your organization caters mainly to the religious and ultra-religious community, and I want to understand why there's a need for an organization that's religious, ultra-religious. Sure. Why don't people just go to the regular hotlines or organizations that are out there?
So it's a good question, and there's a couple reasons, because first of all, I mean, obviously sexual abuse and the aftermath of sexual abuse is incredibly difficult for everybody. That's across the board. It's religious, secular, it doesn't matter. I've never met anyone who said yes there. However, first of all, there are many resources that exist in the secular community for survivors of abuse. Now, I've never heard of a single organization that would turn away somebody who's religious, obviously, but most of their staff, most of their experience is within certain settings in certain circles. And that can be somewhat alienating sometimes for survivors who feel like their experience is very much marked and defined by the community that they're in, being the religious community. So first of all, it's, actually I'll take it to even more basic than that. There are some survivors that won't reach out to the secular resources that are available. They're considered pasnish. They're not accepted in these communities. This isn't something that would ever be okay. They don't see them, or the people that are in their lives don't see these as really valid services that should be reached out to. And also any advice that they get is going to automatically be tainted by, well, it's coming from this secular organization, so you can't take what they're saying seriously. So that's number one. But even if you take survivors who either are open-minded and enough to see that, resources is resources and we need all the help that we can get, or have unfortunately been burned so much that they're willing to really look anywhere, there are nuances that don't always translate from one community to the next. So, for example, when I bring a survivor of abuse, a married woman who was sexually abused by her rabbi, and she's telling the police how the rabbi told her she has to do X, Y, and Z, and he told her that if she doesn't do it, then all of this time that he has spent advising her is going to be Bittul Torah, and that's going to be on her shoulders vis-a-vis God. And that she's going to, this is on her head, all this time that he's wasted helping her, and therefore she has to do what he's telling her to do. And I'm sitting in front of a room, two completely secular police
non-religious, they have no idea.
Why would you? So just leave the room. There's no weapon, not really fully understanding the level of force. And to say that to a Haredi woman is like holding a gun to her head. I mean, the threat there is profound. And even as sensitive as the police might be, they may not really fully understand the depth of that kind of manipulation. So there's a lot of things like that. The impact of the concern on shidduchim, on matchmaking for families,
absolutely
is huge, as well as just getting into schools. And we really try to look at things holistically, where when I sit down in front of a family, and to me, it's 1,000% obvious that these people need to go to the police. They need to go to the police. The abuser in this situation is dangerous. He is still preying on people. This needs to be reported. This man needs to be taken off the streets. But I also know that it might be all good and fine for me to say you should go to the police, but I'm not the one that's going to have to live with it the next day. I'm not the one whose kids are going to get thrown out of school. If they go to I'm not the one going to the police, they're going to the police. And so I also have to make sure that they're being supported in taking all that into account. Do they have systems in place of support? Do they have a rabbi that's going to back them up to their children's school if that's needed? Can I help them find a rabbi who's going to back them up to their children's school? So I'm there to help them get to the police, but I'm also there to make sure to try to help them minimize the backlash that they're going to get once that happens.
I just have to tell you a story that once I was in a Beit Din with a woman who was abused by her husband, and the rabbis in the Beit Din, in the religious courts, asked her, why didn't she go to the police? And she said, she was Haredi, and she said, you're not allowed to go to the police. How could I have gone to the police? And it was very awkward, because the rabbis were mad at her that she hadn't gone to the police, because it would have helped them to make a stronger decision on her case. And she was like, how could they tell me to go to the police when it's wrong? So I fully understand all those things. And yeah, I guess there's a lot of sensitivities that I know about because I'm religious, and a non-religious person wouldn't have any idea what's going on, the shidduch thing. And yeah, I can relate to that fully. Okay, so now I want to take the conversation to understand what impact has the war had, and what are you seeing these days since October 7th?
So in the days, obviously, in the days immediately after the war started on October 7th, and the days after, we were, like everybody in the country, and probably every Jewish person in the world to some degree, dealing with just a tremendous amount of the shock and horror of what we were seeing and hearing. There were some immediate thoughts that kind of came to all of our minds as far as the staff and Magen. There was a real concern that we had about how this was going to impact just safety of children, as you referenced this earlier, that, as we know, in times of high conflict, vulnerable populations always end up paying the highest prices, and often that is specifically women and children. Before we even knew the extent of the sexual violence that was happening, or that had happened on October 7th, and the extent of the depravities that had gone on, we were thinking about, okay, there's a war starting, and we know what happens during the war. That is that there's less supervision. Parents are incredibly stressed and strapped for time, mental energy, etc. There's less emotional reserves available to deal with potential issues. And abusers also, unfortunately, use those opportunities to prey on victims. We'll use those moments of high stress and where people aren't paying as close attention and where there's a lot of chaos to find and abuse victims. So that was really in the first night, I think, like on October 7th, Saturday night, I remember there were conversations going on in our staff group about this and about how obviously we couldn't even begin to talk about this yet because we weren't like everyone was just reeling, but we immediately were thinking about this, even though we had to somewhat put it on the back burner for a couple of weeks as far as addressing it on a real public level.
That's like our organization thinking of agunot and chalitza and all these things that we deal with in our organization. So everyone has their topic that they are immediately.
Yeah, totally. Okay, you immediately think, okay, that's about to blow up. And yeah.
And then you wait a couple of weeks till you actually dare to bring it up.
For sure. Yeah. And then obviously, of course, within a few days, we started hearing about the sexual violence, the extent of the sexual violence that was being reported that had happened. And that was, I mean, like I said, the horror was too much to really process. And right away after that, we realized that this was going to be excruciating for survivors of abuse, for all survivors of abuse, for anyone who had previously dealt with sexual violence on every level. Hearing about this kind of abuse in such a public way and repeatedly, and you couldn't obviously get away from it, of course, rightfully so. It was on every time you turned on the radio, you open a newspaper, you walk past a TV, it's they're talking about sexual violence, often in graphic detail. And then, of course, was the next phase of the denial. And how triggering that is for survivors to just see that constant rhetoric, whether it's online or whatever form that it is. Well, where's the pictures? Well, where's the, we don't believe that. And
when you say denial, who's denying
the world?
You're talking about the world. Okay. Yeah, sure. I felt like that is emotionally killing me.
Yes.
The idea of denial. Yeah. That was like,
it's horrific. It's the epitome of gaslighting. It's like you're being, when you feel like you're being attacked, and then also nobody believes you're being attacked, and you have to prove that you're being attacked. And that's absolutely horrible. And for survivors of abuse who experienced that in the past, obviously on a smaller level in terms of from their parents or from their teachers or from their community, and now they're watching this happen on a global level, on this global stage, incredibly triggering, incredibly painful. And we started setting up a few support groups for the survivors of abuse that we had meaning survivors who'd been abused before October 7th. We're now dealing with this unbelievable sort of re-traumatization of hearing and seeing what was going on. And what we also saw right away, and was not at all surprising to me, is that our hotline was actually, and this might be counterintuitive for many people, the hotline initially was silent. We had almost nobody reaching out in those first few. First of all, when people are in a state of total shock and really a fight for physical survival, you don't know if a terrorist is about to break down your door anywhere. Sexual abuse, actually, I mean, if you learn about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of the need for that physical safety of just not being killed, everything gets pushed down, even something as horrible and as that necessitates intervention as sexual abuse. So for a few days, we heard absolutely nothing. And then even after that, there really was a sense, and this is something that unfortunately is a nitiyah, something that we see a lot with survivors, this tendency to minimize what happened to themselves.
Oh, for sure. Because compared to this, what we're seeing, what happened to me is nothing.
Compared to them,
I understand that.
This is nothing. And I shouldn't be taking up resources that need to go to someone else. And obviously, in wartime, there is something commendable about, making sure that the resources go to who really need it most. And I don't want to negate that, but there's no competition for pain. And that can't be, just because what someone went through is horrific doesn't mean what happened to you. It doesn't make it any less traumatic and any less horrible, and doesn't make you any less deserving of resources and help and support. And our staff started actively reaching out to survivors to check in with them. And they were,
wow,
there was a lot.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a very, really, it required a lot more, like we had to actually initiate these conversations, because people were not reaching out to us because they wanted, leave the lines free for the people that really, really need it right now. And something else that I think is really important to always keep in mind is that resiliency is something that we need to be spreading. So it's the opposite of, we need to be looking at this, not as we need to leave the resources for the people who really need it. Yes, of course, we need to make sure the people who need it most have resources, but we also need to make sure that everybody has some degree of resources, because we all need to be sort of boosting our emotional reserves to be able to care for each other.
We all need
Yes.
help. Otherwise, we won't be able to help the people around us.
100%.
It's everything you're saying is so amazing. I'm like, I have thoughts running through my mind, but I can't stop you because it's so important what you're saying.
I appreciate it.
Wow.
It was so we offered a lot of resources to survivors, to just sort of checking in with them and supporting them, and the support groups. We heard from survivors, really some really just there was one young woman that was in one of our groups who said that she had not left her house for like a month. She had not left. She barely left her bedroom, like just to get some food, and she was barely leaving her bed until she attended the group and actually had some support in a more comprehensive way, and people who she could talk to and check in with. And we just really saw how critical that was. And then after a few weeks, we started moving more into the muganut, the safety kind of space, when people were a little bit more ready to hear about it, and specifically focusing on, I mean, first of all, there was some focused on the general community. We offered a lot of some work online, some educational events on Zoom. Just to give an example of the kind of educational tip that we would kind of share with parents, in that something that's important to keep in mind in wartime, something very basic that we just sort of forget about. There's, one of the general safety rules that we always talk to parents about is the importance of putting thought into bedroom layouts, in your home. We're dealing mostly with the Haredi community, families that tend to have a lot of children. And there should be thought. Part of your creating safety in your household there should be a little bit of thought put into which children share bedrooms with each other. Do older children, is it best practice that older children be sharing bedrooms with younger children? Certainly when there are guests coming, do we want to be putting guests into a bedroom with children? Like, should they be sharing bedrooms? This is something we talk about a lot.
Very important.
And now we have a war,
Very important.
and a very large percentage of the country is sticking all their children, and sometimes the adults, into one bedroom, being the mamad.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Obviously, it is necessary. And when it comes to safety, again, we need to prioritize.
But we have to think about it. We have to give some thought to it. That people are sleeping on top of each other.
100%. And there also has to be some acknowledgement that we need to say it out loud to our children. We need to acknowledge the fact that we've just upended one of our safety rules in our house. And maybe it's important that we at least verbalize to our children that just because this safety rule has kind of gone out the window at the moment in lieu, to make place for a different safety rule, that doesn't mean all our safety rules are going out the window. We still need to be respecting each other's privacy, and people still need, bodily autonomy is still important.
We don't have that much time. And I want to go back to the question of the hotels, because that's been bothering me ever since I heard that idea that who knows what's happening in the hotel. It's been on my mind, and I need to hear what you know about it and what can be done.
So the next kind of area and space that we really started focusing on was the hotels and centers that have been housing a lot of the refugees and evacuees from the South and the North. There are a number of organizations that do this kind of work, this kind of educational work and prevention work that started moving right away into the hotels and the centers, but not a lot or any organizations that really work with the Haredi community. We got a call a few weeks into the war from a woman who had been at one of the centers in Bnei Brak that was housing families from Netivot. And she was there because she runs an organization that was providing, money for funds for food. This was not related to our field specifically. She called us in such a state of panic and like trauma from what she had seen. And she said, I told them I will only provide them with the funding for the food if they call Magen, because I walked in there. She said, it's a catastrophe. I can't even describe to you what's going on. And it took a little time to convince the people involved, the organizers, that this was really necessary and why this was so important. We spent some time kind of just adjusting our materials to really focus a lot on resilience as well, because to me, it felt very unfair to take a group of mothers who have just been parents, they're out of their homes. They don't know when they're going to go back. They don't know if they're going to go back. They don't know if there's going to be a home to go back to. They've maybe lost their jobs. Their children are out of school. Everything is on its head. And to say, and now here's something else to worry about, sexual abuse. There you go. It was not. So we really wanted to do this in a way that was especially empowering and gave them really concrete tools of how do you, in times of chaos, how do you create at least moments of calm roga, of stability with your children, so you can open up these conversations, so that you can make sure that the situation is safe, so that you can notice if there's red flags, if something's going on, if boundaries are being crossed. We went to, in particular, I mentioned that one center, we had 5 staff members who went. When I walked in, I will tell you the honest truth, for the first few minutes, I thought there is no way in hell that we are going to manage to do this, because there were hundreds of women, there were children everywhere. I mean, we went upstairs, if you've ever seen a picture of like a refugee camp in Africa, picture that, but with Haredi people. It was literally that. I'm talking like piles of garbage, children playing in the garbage area. Like, there were areas, we accidentally got off the elevator on the wrong floor at one point, and we found this parking garage that was deserted, that just had children everywhere. There were just children. There was nobody. It was really terrifying. And somehow, and I really give all the credit to our amazing staff, who we broke the whole room, broke it into groups. So everyone had about between 40 to 50 women, and sat them in a circle. And we really spent like 2.5 hours with them, and just talking and sharing and learning, and it was unbelievable. And we've done this now in a few places.
Do you know that things are possibly happening, or
we know that things are definitely happening? We've had reports of sexual abuse in the hotels. And there was a story shared in the media that a couple of the volunteers in some of the hotels one of them had a history of had a past criminal conviction for sexually abusing a child.
That's brilliant. And then go volunteer.
Another one is currently on trial for sexual abuse of a child. He's just out, he's out during the course of the case, and he was volunteering in a hotel. And the problem is that really it's, and again, I don't usually give so much understanding to, because this sounds like gross negligence, obviously, but at the same time, if you keep in mind that these hotels were set up,
we know that,
from moment to moment, mostly by volunteers, completely drowning in the number of, dealing with this massive, just a huge number of people who've lost their homes. They might not even have clothing.
They're all bunched together in a room, like the whole family is in one room, and it's just, and the kids are roaming around, the youngsters, they sometimes have school, sometimes they don't, and nobody knows what's going on with people. Yeah.
And we've spent some time even going through, one of our staff members did a walkthrough of in one of the hotels with some of the staff, and pointed out to them, even just some small, like, for example, they had an area that was being used as sort of a play area for the kids. And it had no windows. There was really like no, and she was like, okay, well, this is like a really kind of straightforward, if you move the play area to a room that has windows, where you can see it, you automatically stepping up the potential for something to go on, whether it's with an adult or with children. At one point, while she was there, she saw a man come in, walk up to a group of children, take 2 little girls, and walk down into the stairwell with them. And she's just looking around what is this? Who is this guy? Is anyone seeing this? And it turns out he was a volunteer, and he was they got rid of that guy. So they started creating rules that the volunteers need to know. They are not allowed to take the children, any child, alone into any other area of the hotel other than the main where they're. And if they break those rules, they're done. Like, there has to be real red lines here. So there's a lot of work to be done. And again, it's important to keep in mind that there are so many different priorities right now.
I want to say that I had like 5 more questions to ask you, and I haven't even gotten to them. I will suggest everyone to look into the site of Magen. I went over the booklet called Parents' Guide for Safety that all parents should read. I thought it was fantastic. It was amazing. And I have to say that it really caters for everyone. I mean, I understand that you're especially for the Dati and Haredi groups of people, but it doesn't push the religion in your face, and anyone can read it and learn from it. I was fascinated by everything that I read there. Thank you so much, Shana, for talking with me today. I want to remind ourselves that not only women, but men and boys also suffer from sexual harassment. When we wrote out the introduction that we say every episode, that we're talking about women, we're listening to women because we want to hear their experiences as women, to hear their voices and their stories, we should also be aware of the fact that it's not only women we're talking about. In giving women the chance to talk about issues that are more specific to women, we are including men that may be experiencing the same things, but are even more secretive about their stories than women are. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. By listening to this podcast and giving women's voices your attention, you give them power. If you, like us, agree that women's perspectives are essential to the Israeli narrative, subscribe to the Voices of Women at Wartime wherever you get your podcasts, and encourage your friends to listen and subscribe too. If you have thoughts, questions, or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media on the Center for Women's Justice page, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or wherever. Thank you, Rabbi Scott Kahn, for the recording and editing. I'm Rivka Lubitch. Be well and stay safe.